Good afternoon, everyone. Fresh back from lunch, coffee, awake. So I think we're going to start the session so that we don't go over time. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you this afternoon to moderate this panel on bridging the gap, addressing the impact, supply, and demand mismatch. So the session will last about an hour and 15 minutes. During the next hour with our panel of experts, we will explore together the various bottlenecks preventing capital from flowing at scale towards the companies, the entrepreneurs, and the projects that need it. We talked a lot this morning about this need for finance to go where it is crucially needed. And today we're really going to try and have a very practical discussion about the best practices and the emerging real-world solutions that are available for bridging this gap today. And what's really important is that for about 45-50 minutes, we'll have this discussion with our experts, but afterwards it would be really great to be able to get questions, thoughts from the room in order to really start to build these solutions and to think about what these solutions could look like going forward. To help guide this conversation, I'm joined today by a distinguished panel of experts. I'll spend a little bit of time going through their backgrounds because I think it's really important to ground who they are and what they bring also to this important discussion. So we have Liliana Dessa-Kirchhoff, who is sitting over here. She is the head of Private Sector Development Division in the Economic Development Cooperation Directorate at the Swiss State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, SECO. Sustainable finance and impact investing are a key priority for SECO, with dedicated programs on framework conditions and investment instruments, such as the Swiss Investment Fund for Emerging Markets, CIFEM, or the Private Investment Development Group, PIDG, under its supervision. Liliana has a keen understanding of promoting a better business environment and access to finance, as well as capacity building to foster entrepreneurship and innovation, having held senior positions as Swiss Executive Director's Office at the World Bank Group and at the IFC. In addition, she was responsible for the setup and implementation of a 130 million cohesion program in Hungary. The next speaker joining me is Jan van Binsen, who's sitting next to me. Jan is country manager at the IFC and head of the Frankfurt office. He is responsible for stakeholder relations, including the private sector, government, and development finance institutions in Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, and Switzerland, to bring private sector investments in emerging countries. Prior to taking up his position in November 2020, he served at IFC as regional manager for the Caucasus and held roles for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. Jan brings a rich understanding of both mobilizing private finance for emerging economies and experience in mainstream finance, having worked for ABN AMRO in corporate banking project finance for 14 years. The next speaker is Jerry Parks, and we're delighted that he was able to make it despite the COVID measures that have entered into force. I think it was a struggle, but we're really delighted to have you. Jerry is the CEO and co-founder of Injaro Investments, a private capital management firm with over a decade experience of impact investments in Africa. Under his leadership, Injaro has secured mandates to manage Injaro Agriculture Capital Holdings, a 50 million fund, and to serve as investment advisor to the Agri-Business Capital Fund, a 200 million fund. Since inception in 2009, Injaro has made over 35 million of investments in African small, medium enterprises, which have benefited over 3 million people. He also serves on the board of African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Jerry has a deep understanding and expertise of both building truly impactful portfolios in Africa and mainstream finance, as he has worked for a UK-based fund manager and activist private equity investor, and served a variety of clients in advisory capacity at Accenture, Merrill Lynch, UBS, and Technoserve. Bertrand Badré. Bertrand is the managing director and founder of Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital. Previously, Bertrand was managing director of the World Bank and World Bank Group, chief financial officer. He has also held positions as financial officer at Société Générale and Crédit Agricole and served as a member of President Jacques Chirac's officer, Jacques Chirac diplomatic team, as his deputy personal representative for Africa. He spent 7 years at Lazare in New York, London, and latterly in Paris as managing director, where he co-led the restructuring of Eurotunnel. Bertrand brings the panel an impressive background across public and private sectors. He's also a prolific author, having written 2 books, Can Finance Save the World? And more recently, Voulons-nous sérieusement changer le monde? Do we really seriously want to change the world? As well as published articles including From Billions to Trillions. And last but not least, Christian Frutiger. Ambassador Christian Frutiger is Assistant Director General at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, the SDC, where he is responsible for 5 global programs in the areas of climate change, water, migration, health, and food security, as well as for the financial and strategic engagement with Switzerland's priority multilateral organizations. Through these programs, SDC develops and promotes comprehensive, internationally agreed solutions in fields where traditional forms of cooperation may no longer be sufficient. Christian has deep knowledge as well, like all these other panelists, of both public and private and non-governmental sectors. Prior to joining SDC, he worked as global head of public affairs for Nestlé, a company he joined after more than 14 years in the field at ICRC. So, without further ado, with all of these people around the table, I'd like to kick off this panel with a question to you around what is the real main obstacle or the main obstacles to mobilizing the capital needed to meet the 2030 agenda? Because we heard a lot about it this morning, and with your experience in this space, you probably can shed some light on this. And perhaps when you're responding, are some SDGs more suited to private finance than others? And perhaps we'll start with you, Jan.
Okay, good afternoon. First of all, great pleasure to be here. So thank you very much for including the World Bank Group. IFC is a member of the World Bank Group, a sister organization of the World Bank. The World Bank is represented here in Geneva. Actually, the special representative, Maria Dimitriadou, sits there at the corner. So as IFC, we are the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And actually, we are the largest investor into the private sector in emerging markets globally. That's what we do. We also are a trendsetter in terms of sustainable finance. Actually, what we do, everything we do is sustainable, already for the past few decades. So we can talk about it more, but it means in terms of developing standards, social and environmental standards, the so-called performance standards of the World Bank Group, are being used now for 80% of all product financing projects in emerging markets. So about 100 international banks use the IFC standards as their standards, and with that have created a level playing field. So IFC, we are present in 100 countries, 4,500 people. We invest about $30 billion into emerging markets every year, to give you some idea. Now, what is needed most, and that's the view of IFC, is also the new strategy that we have, is basically create more bankable projects in emerging markets. Because you have demand and supply, and is also the topic of this session here today, is on the one hand, indeed, the supply of money going into emerging markets. I talk about emerging markets, not specifically. But then also the question is, where does it go? And hence we as IFC focus increasingly on what we call creating markets. So what does it mean? It means open up sectors in countries around the world for the private sector to step in. That is basically what we do. And I can talk more later about how we do that. But the main obstacle, as we see it, is indeed particularly that. So we see on the supply side, yes, more investors need to be interested as well to go into emerging markets. About 8% of pension fund money goes into emerging markets, only 8%. For insurance companies, it's only 2%. So if those numbers basically get doubled or tripled, then yes, we need that as well in order to bridge the gap and reach the Sustainable Development Goals. But more importantly, the way that we see it, is to say, where does it then go? And so on the supply side is, as I said, so we do some work there as well in terms of standard setting. but particularly on the demand side is that we work with governments to identify those opportunities. So perhaps I should leave it with that for the opening, and then more than happy to expand on it. Thank you.
Jerry, thoughts from the ground?
Thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here to share my views, which include views from the front line. So probably I should permit myself to be a bit controversial. It's the moment we say bankable projects, it means we've already taken a position about what is defined as bankable. We're making a requirement for the projects, and the projects we're talking about here are supposed to be SDG compliant projects that help us achieve the SDG goals. We're requiring them to be financially lucrative. And all these goals cannot be financially lucrative on day one. So probably when Jan talks about building the markets, this is part of what we need to think about. And we need to go beyond creating a conducive environment. We need to be prepared to pay for some of these outcomes if we believe that they are important. So I think that's one of the things that I think if we want, sort of a new angle, there should be a clear thinking from the capital providers around which SDG goals, which outcomes we are willing to pay for, and for what period of time we're willing to pay for them until there are enough business ideas, enough entrepreneurs and businesses that can then create the bankable projects. I think that the second obstacle that I see is possibly inefficient collaboration between the two big silos of capital providers, the philanthropic capital and the commercial capital. In my close to 12 years experience working in impact investment, this is probably one of the biggest sources of tension that people do not talk about enough. And I'll probably get told off for saying this by my investors because I have people from both camps. And what often happens is that either camp comes up with a great idea for resolving SDG challenges and presents it to the market as a fait accompli and expects the other side of the other camp to just bring their capital to leverage the capital that they have. Normally, when it's the private sector players, they want it to be de-risked and risk mitigation. And then when it's the philanthropic side, they're looking for leverage, but not necessarily wanting to compromise on the level to which an SDG will be paid for. So without going too much into detail, I think that's the second element. The bankable projects, yes, but we also need to be willing to subsidize a bit more, and then there needs to be closer collaboration between the two big silos of capital providers, the philanthropic capital and the private commercial capital. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, great point. I completely agree. Looking at this from a development organization's perspective, I'd say still the single biggest challenge is the risk-return logic, which still the vast majority of investments are made based off, and that includes impact investment. So this is still the main common determinator, and that's of course a huge challenge. We're looking at impact now gradually, but still the predominant logic is risk return. Blended finance has helped us go a bit of the way. But of course, if we look at this again from a perspective of the Swiss Development Agency, it goes only to some countries, and it never goes down completely to the least developed countries. We are always in the range of the middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries. But of course, it doesn't go to the least developed countries. It doesn't go to the poorest. And it only works really well in some sectors: environment, clean energy. We've been talking about it a lot. But there are other sectors which are absolutely critical to sustainable development. Health, we've all experienced it, even in our own countries. Look at migration, look at agriculture, look at education, look at water. And that's maybe part of the answer to your second question. All SDGs, yes, absolutely, again, from a development agency, we are addressing all SDGs. We're looking at the poorest of the poor, leaving no one behind. But then a way to decide on how to focus is maybe also the way which we have structured our international cooperation strategy in Switzerland, is looking at needs on the one hand, needs on the ground, so real needs, not perceived needs, real needs on the ground, looking at what is your interest and what is your capacity, and then what is your added value. And in this combination, you probably manage then to hone in on where you can make a difference. So in principle, all SDGs, but then we have to focus, we have to break it down into manageable and investable bits, and more about that later.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity as well to be here. There are many reasons why capital is not flowing to SDG financing. Let me mention two, which I think are quite important. What we see very often with institutional investors is really a knowledge gap. They're really overwhelmed, and sometimes they don't know where to start. There are so many standards, there is a lot of talk, but there is not one methodology, to say, okay, this is how we measure, this is a product we can enter. So I think this has been a big obstacle, and this is one area we have also cooperated with the IFC, for example, when we teamed up on the EGO Fund, the Global Emergence Fund, one of the largest fund on green bonds, was the largest one when it was launched a few years ago, mobilized more than $1 billion US dollars. And SECO provided with other donors technical assistance to introduce first time for financial institutions in emerging and developing countries green bonds. And I think that's one way, to crowd in institutional investors. And as was said, if you just double these few percentages, you get a lot of volume into the system. So this is one way. Standards is another way, and we have supported, for example, the Climate Bond Initiative as the first government also some years ago to create credible standards on green bonds. Now everyone is talking about greenwashing, so it's important to have credible standards, and these standards were worked out on different topics from agriculture, transportation, and so on, with technical experts, with scientists, and so on. But then the other big obstacle is also the risk perception. It's what you don't know, you usually see as more risky as products and geographies that you're familiar with. And sometimes the risk is really larger, but sometimes it's really just a perceived higher risk. And for example, the Swiss CFEM, which was mentioned, the Swiss Development Finance Institution, has been investing for decades in developing countries and actually has always achieved a positive return. So, and IFC as well. So, you can see that it's possible to invest in developing countries, creating impact and achieving return. It is possible, but you need experience, you need a certain business model, and there are quite some ingredients. And one way we tested a collaboration was 4 years ago when we teamed up with UBS and Symbiotics, where we created the Loan for Growth Fund. It was targeting SMEs, small and medium enterprises, the financing, so the missing middle. Microfinance works, the large companies also get financing, but very often the SMEs lack actually access to finance. So UBS and SECO each invested first loss share, 2.5 million. So we were ready if the fund would make a loss to take the first hit. And with this 5 million, an additional 45 million could be mobilized from purely private capital. And that was a very successful example to show that with this blended finance structure, we could crowd in capital. 4 years later, the fund is closed, has made a positive return again. The first loss was not used, so it was, again, the risk was perceived higher than it was. And very tangible results could be achieved, from creating 11,000 jobs, female-owned, a third female-owned SME supported, and many other aspects. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Liliane. Bertrand?
Thank you, Anne-Laure. You were generous enough to mention my last book called Do We, open brackets, seriously want to change the world? And of course, the word which is important in that title is seriously. I think the whole issue we are facing today is that I don't think anybody is truly serious about what we want to achieve. Let me come back to 2015, when we all agreed in New York in September on the SDG, and in Paris in December on COP21. At that time, I was at the World Bank, so I was participating to all these discussions. And what really struck me at that time was the little attention that was paid to the necessary changes to the system that were required. We kind of all saw that the invisible hand would work its way, that it was okay that Barack Obama and Xi Jinping shook hands and that they show us the directions and everybody will follow. And of course, it didn't work. We were off track before COVID. We are off track after COVID. Not much has changed in the system through the COVID. I was expecting that COVID would provoke a reaction, at least with the international organization, which did not happen. It's still a little bit more of the same. And where does it lead us? So first of all, we are off track. Second, we have two big warnings. On the one hand, the BIS in Basel published a report in September saying there is a green bubble. There is too much money chasing too little assets. And that doesn't show there is a mismatch, actually. Actually, there is too much money for too little assets. So where is the problem? Is the demand not well formulated, or is the supply not well articulated, or is it something bigger? On the other hand, a business school, French business school called EDEC, has reviewed systematically all green, sustainable, impact, ESG passive investment vehicles, and they found out that only 12% was relevant, meaning 88% had nothing to do with anything like that. It's like the concentrate. You put a drop of mint, and you expect the whole thing to become green. So this is a situation today. So we're not serious. It doesn't mean that we don't do anything, and we are all here on table to say we are doing things, and many in these rooms, some I know, are doing things. But it's just things. And we all know that the big challenge is scale, that the big challenge is moving from micro to macro. And to get there, I'm afraid, we have to take our toolbox. We have to open the hood and we have to work the engine. And that's what we have not really started to do yet. And that's, for me, the big question. We are still very much, it was mentioned this morning, very much driven by the Milton Friedman's approach, which is the only purpose of business is to increase its profits, meaning profit is an end to an end. Whereas profit should be a means to an end. And as long as we don't touch accounting standards, as long as we don't touch fiduciary duties, as long as we don't touch reporting standards, as long as compensation policy and so on and so forth, we will be fragile and we will be prone to washing. Because we are still very much, and Liliana said that, in the fog. I mean, you have more than 150 methodology to describe ESG. You choose the one you like, the one that makes you look better. It's like a mirror. So I think there is a lot that needs to be done, and I don't want us to fool ourselves. Somebody asked me a question a few weeks ago, say, but Bertrand, what's the problem? We have $40 trillion of AUM, which are ESG. So the problem is solved. Yeah, if it was so simple, we would not be here to discuss. So we all know, consciously or unconsciously, that we are not there yet. So we have to be serious. We have to move a step further. And that's very difficult, because in 2015, and probably many of us thought the same, we thought it would be an incremental change. And now we see that it's a radical way to review our consumption, our production, our financial tools, the way we use financial analysis, etc. I mean, Ronnie Cohen mentioned, we discussed that many times, it's no longer a risk return, it's risk return and impact. But I mean, ask every business school. I mean, I can ask Marie-Laure and others. You speak on the corporate side and on the corporate responsibility side of the business school. Yes, we discuss that. And then you go to the finance curriculum. It doesn't change. And so on and so forth. So I think the real issue, of course, bankable projects, of course, risk perception, etc. But we have to go one step further. We have to embed in our system what is truly needed to address that issue. And that, I think, we are not there yet. Coming to what SDG is a priority, I don't want to leave that question because it's very subjective. Some people like water, some people like health, some people like education. We need to have a systemic approach. I really believe this is a way to see all of the things together and not just a piecemeal approach where we know we have a number of positive and negative spillover effects. When you target climate, then you have a problem on nature, and when you target nature, you have a problem, etc. We have to embrace this. It's easier said than done, but I think it's just starting. We discussed offline, and let me finish with that. ESG is very nice. I think it's a great way to socialize the issue, to discuss what is of concern today. But as we say, this is just the first step on the Jacob's ladder, and there are many, many steps to go to heaven.
Beautifully put. Yeah, this distinction between ESG integration and impact, right, which is absolutely key. Yeah. What are the outcomes versus how are environmental and social factors impacting the risk-return characteristics of my investments? But I'd like to go into a little bit more what you talked about, right? What's the toolbox we have? What are the solutions that we have to address, for example, the supply and demand mismatch? And here I'll turn maybe to you, Jan, because IFC has been working in this space for decades and working in cooperation with other actors, as we heard before. What is your strategy for closing the supply and demand gap?
Okay, well, we strongly believe in, just to follow through on what some of the other speakers said, that sustainability is not an afterthought. And one of the topics that I picked up this morning when it went about the financial sector is, you say, well, you know what, once the cost of funding goes up, if companies, banks basically don't follow this through, then, you know, they feel the pressure. And basically the point made was related to profitability again, right? So as IFC, we start offering advisory services for decarbonization, but we do this to companies who are truly committed to climate change. And with that, we mean that we check if the remuneration package throughout the organization takes it into account. So if we have a company who does not have this included, or let's say that the CEO says, well, you know, I appointed somebody for sustainability at my board, so speak to that person, we don't want to deal with them. It should be part of the remuneration package of the CEO, of the CFO, of the treasurer, because that is basically an indication that it is truly in the DNA. And I think, yes, it is of course a matter of time, but we do see more and more companies who basically get this. If you don't take this seriously, you're on your way out. You cannot survive. This is really the future, the way that we go. Okay, fine. So what do we do then as IFC? As I said earlier, on the supply side for the investor base, as IFC, we mobilize about $8 billion a year. That is basically as part of the 30 billion that I mentioned that we invest. So working indeed with banks, but also with investors through vehicles. So that means that we create vehicles. We have now just launched, or are about to launch, 2 new vehicles, one for 2 billion, one for 3 billion, which are capital market, basically vehicles in the form of bonds, where indeed the pension funds and insurance companies and others can come in. We have done this in the past as well, but we issue bonds ourselves to fund ourselves. We have issued more than 180 green bonds over the past 12 years in more than 20 countries. So you do see that there are indeed investors who would like to buy those bonds, because again, what I said earlier, everything that we do is sustainable. And then we have also on the supply side developed, together with asset managers, asset owners, the operating principles for impact investing. So what are those principles? So what do they say? And actually here in Switzerland, we are very pleased. There are quite a number of companies here in Switzerland, indeed, who already have signed up. No doubt some of you are here in the audience as well. So basically this means that there must be indeed a very clear intent for these investors before you start investing, outlining what you want to achieve. in terms of the E&S impact in particular. It means that also in the origination and structuring that the investors clearly lay out what they plan to do and not just afterwards. During the portfolio management, monitor this, and then particularly afterwards, when the exit is there, also plan the exit such, bearing in mind the sustainability of the company, if you want, in terms of the impact. So that means you don't exit at the wrong time, if you want. Plus, that there is an independent evaluation of the alignment of what you actually do with these principles. So at this point in time, we have 148 organizations around the world, of which 31 DFIs and MDBs, and for the rest asset managers, also banks, basically signed up for a total of 422 billion in assets in these form of impact assets. So what we try to do here is indeed set the standard. So that's on the supply side. What we do on the demand side, IFC traditionally, we've been around for 65 years, have invested in emerging markets. The goal that we have as IFC is the same with the World Bank. You're basically a sister organization, we're part of the World Bank Group, right? Is to reduce and ultimately eliminate, if you want, poverty in the world. And as IFC, we do that by means of the private sector. So we purely only work with the private sector and with governments to promote and to improve the private sector climate. So yes, so we have invested in sectors like energy, in telecom, well, in all sectors, but I think in terms of the SDGs, let's say telecoms, energy, infrastructure, health and education are the ones that have proven to be more suitable for bankable projects. And indeed, I take the point what bankable is. And I think indeed what is needed is more blended finance. You need to include more concessional financing, but only in those projects where it is really needed to de-risk the project, and not in projects to position yourself as a lender in a more favorable way, because then you basically misuse. That's our strong view. So we do feel there is too much competition amongst the DFIs. Hence that we take initiative as World Bank Group and as IFC to bring them more basically together as a group. So it's another action that we take to basically get more alignment amongst the DFIs. And then the final point, what I said earlier, is what I said is creating markets. So what does it mean? Rather than wait until a market is ready for the private sector to come in, say, yes, there is a project that's being tendered out in a particular sector in country X, and companies approach us, can we finance it, etc. So that we basically take a step back and we look country by country, and only emerging markets is what we do, right? And to identify which sectors in a country do we think are conducive for the private sector to come in, but then certain regulatory or legislative changes are needed. So we point that out to the government. And we also let them know what we think should happen in terms of those changes. And we also let them know how we can help as World Bank Group. And in that sense, say World Bank Group, we work strongly together with indeed the colleagues of indeed the World Bank. So these are a number of points that we tangibly do to try to narrow the gap.
Yeah, thank you so much. So really this focus on standard setting more on the supply side. But of course, we know, and we mentioned this morning, that we can't wait for standards to do this, right? It's good that we're doing them. We need them. We need a common language. I think it comes back to also your knowledge gap point. But on the other hand, there's people today, like you, Jerry, that are, where your firm is managing, impact investments today in Africa. What are you missing? What are you missing in terms of infrastructure? What are you missing from private finance?
I think I'll probably respond by maybe trying to clarify the overall ecosystem and the roles that various people play in there. Because as a financial intermediary, my role is quite simple: is to go into the markets and identify the entrepreneurs and the businesses that are working on SDGs that I think might be interesting to capital providers, right? Now, the way the world works is that I can then take these ideas to a capital provider, and if the idea doesn't match what they're looking for in terms of return, in terms of impact, in terms of their risk tolerance, nothing happens. So what ends up happening is that the focus of the investments, and I can understand why someone would talk about a green bubble. It's a green bubble for certain sectors, the most bankable sectors. So what ends up happening is that a pragmatic financial intermediary will then simply design projects that respond to the needs of the largest and the most willing providers of capital. And if you have a financial background like mine, then it's more likely I'll be defining it for the more commercial investors. And this then affects the ecosystem. So this is a roundabout way of going back to my first point, which is we need more end-to-end collaboration. And I'll give two examples, both from the two funds that I manage. In the first fund, we had an organization called AGRA, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, which spent a lot of money giving grants to small farmers and trying to convert them into commercial seed producers. They probably funded about 30 of these farmers in West Africa, probably another 30 in East Africa. They then passed this project on to the next stage in the value chain, financial intermediary, and said, we want you to select from the 30 that we have, those that you think have the best chance of becoming commercially viable. We selected about 5. Okay, out of the 5 that we invested in, 3 of them collapsed, 2 will probably survive. But then those 2 have survived and are doing quite well. But when you look at the journey that was followed, money had to be spent putting grants into 30, putting investments into 5, and then getting 2 of them surviving. And I think this kind of thing that is missing. Then I'll use the second fund example that we have, which is one that the Swiss government is invested in as well, the ABC fund. This one goes a step further. It's not doing so much, it's building on what AGRA did, because AGRA is also an investor in this fund. And it is using a blend finance vehicle and doing one very important thing. It is actually compensating the manager for achieving certain impact outcomes. We tried that in our first fund, but it didn't happen. Because after given all the full mandate and we're told all these impact targets we needed to meet, we said, well, are you going to pay us for achieving those targets? And everyone said, no. You'll be only compensated on the profits. And so we actually carried on, and we're actually compensating our team members based on impact, even though our clients were not compensating us based on impact. We could only do that for so long. After a while, we had to stop because there was no end-to-end link between our compensation and what we're giving to our employees. But the good thing is, for the standards to come into place, you need market actors working together to put in place these new incentives, like we have in the ABC fund, where we have certain elements of impact that link to bonus payments for the manager. So we just need more of this happening. And like I said in the beginning, if there's one thing I wish the ABC fund had done, it would have been trying to bring private investors to the table at the design phase. And I think that would probably have helped us a bit further along. But that being said, experimentation is also or innovation, whatever you want to call it, is a very important part of this initiative. We need to be willing to innovate, and all of our investors, I give credit to all of them, both for our first fund and our second fund, they were willing to innovate and take a chance with something new, knowing that they'd have to learn from it, share those lessons with the overall ecosystem, probably cost them a bit of money, but gradually we're moving towards an improvement in the way we address the SDG goals. Thank you.
That's very interesting and very hands-on in terms of the issues that are faced on the ground. And I'm hearing an echo also of what Jan was saying around this end-to-end collaboration and aligning incentives and bringing different stakeholders around the table early in the process, not after part of the process has already started. Christian, I mean, you work at the SDC. Your ambition, SDGs, voilà. Sorry, slip of the tongue. The ambition is really you are really working at the coalface also of addressing the supply and demand mismatch. And maybe, you're responsible for 5 thematic global programs. I mean, those stretch across, climate change, water, migration, public health, and food security. In those areas, where do you see the role of private finance really coming into play?
Thanks a lot. Well, it won't be possible without private finance. The problem is it's not there. And as I said earlier, we're talking here about the poorest countries. And actually, even if we talk about blended finance, less than 6% of privately raised capital actually goes to the least developed countries. So the delta is huge. The needs are enormous as well. So we have to look at new instruments like actually impact-linked financing, which we've been working on in Latin America. We're now looking at Africa. Agriculture. I mean, I'm not going to repeat what you said on the ABC fund. Our Director General this morning talked about the punishment of agriculture. Agriculture, if we want to make sure that all of us can make a decent living and eat properly and be healthy in the foreseeable future, we actually need agriculture. So it's an opportunity, and it's worth investing in. So what we're looking at in Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda is sort of the level up of the ABC fund, which is called actually Africa, early involvement of investors, looking at impact-linked incentives, and where we are trying, together with a few others, to raise about 800 million Swiss francs in the next few years. Health. We've talked about health, huge opportunities there, huge challenges. What we've seen is that together with the Medicines Patent Pool, we actually managed to now liberate the first 2 treatments for COVID-19 accessible to the poorest countries just a couple of weeks ago. There, if we go beyond into health systems, the demand, I mean, there is maybe a lot of money around. The demand is enormous when we look at health systems. There, huge opportunities will be there. Water, and I deliberately don't talk about climate. It's been talked about, and I think we all see the avenues on climate, but there is much more. Water, West Africa, so we're looking at an international municipal investment fund where we bring down the cross-border dialogue on big water basins in West Africa down to the municipal level, because at the end of the day, it's about the last mile. Water for people, water for agriculture, water for industry. And there we work together with UNCDF, UN Capital Development Fund, again raising private sector capital. First opening is about 300 million. And then I would like to finish with migration, which sort of has this reputation of being more of a problem than an opportunity. As a reminder, about 3% of the world's population, that's about 270 million people, have migrated. They generate 8 to 9% of global GDP. They generate huge remittances. Remittances flows back to the least developed countries are about 3.5 times the size of official development aid. They're bigger than official development aid and private and foreign direct investment together. So there is a gigantic opportunity, and we're probably one of the first development actor now to look at impact-linked finance in facilitating remittances and making those flow. So yes, we are moving in there early, but actually there is a big business opportunity, and so just as a pitch. Look at migrants, look at remittances, and look at migration from a completely different perspective.
Look beyond the green, I think, is a message to investors, no? It's very, very interesting, and I think you mentioned this notion of being a pioneer, going early, right? Being also something that's important. And maybe now, Liliana, Switzerland was a pioneer in microcredit, financial inclusion. You've been working in this space for many years now. Is that not too narrow a definition today? What should Switzerland be doing more? And how can we really address that supply and demand mismatch? What is SECO doing in that space today?
Yes, thank you. It's true that still today sometimes people think that impact investing is microfinance. And of course it's much more, right? But it's true that microfinance now makes still about 0.5% of the impact investing portfolio, and then it's followed by about 1/4 of SME finance, and then you have other topics. So it's still large, and we helped 20 years ago with also co-financing into what became then the largest microfinance fund. This was again an interesting construction. We co-matched an investment with private capital. It was not first loss. It was, sometimes I feel 20 years ago we took more risks than today. And it became then the largest fund, and from there many things happened. Today, still, according to the latest private asset impact fund report, Switzerland is the leading hub for impact investments, with 35% of the assets being managed by asset managers headquartered in Switzerland. And what is also interesting to see is that although impact investing still is a niche with 6% of sustainable finance, it has grown 70% in the last year. So it's really the largest, the fastest growing part within sustainable finance. And that gives some hope that there is demand. I mean, it's not just growing because, it's really growing because also consumers are demanding for this kind of products and services. And that's a good thing, but with 6%, we have still a long way to go, right? And we have at SECO, I mean, coming back also to the SDGs, for us, we don't cover all SDGs, or we cover most of them through, for example, CFEM, but otherwise, certainly SDG 8 on decent jobs is a big priority. SDG 13 on climate action is a big priority. And while at the beginning we used to work, a bit ad hoc, we had some interesting projects and we partnered up with some institutions. In 2017, we launched our first open call for proposal on providing TA funds for impact investment funds. And we basically said, look, if you have interesting proposals that can make a significant impact on SDG 8 or 13, why don't you present it with a credible theory of change, and we can provide some TA funds. And the good thing was that by having an international competitive process, we really got, we could compare the quality, and we got good value for money, because the TA ratio to the fund ratio was much better than the average in the market. And so we had different interesting funds we could support too on the job side, a fishery impact investing fund, mainly investing in Indonesia, MSME fund. But then on the energy side, there was a fund from Responsibility who this fund recently became the Serengeti Fund, which is now a holding, a fund that is incorporated in Africa, and so it has really transitioned from Responsibility to become a local IPP, which is a great story. So I think some of these areas show that we also, through pitch, we have done a lot in the area of renewable energy. And that's certainly an area that attracts a lot of investments. But we see, maybe on the SDG question, I don't think that all the SDGs have the same commercial attractiveness to investors. There are some that are more commercially suitable, others less. And I think, coming back to your point, I think we should address very transparently which areas will never be commercially viable. And then the question will be, well, who should fund for it? Is it the public side? Is it philanthropic capital? I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, even if you look in Switzerland, you know, the debate of health or basic education, should it be private, public? You know, it's also a decision of society. But so I think it's important that we look at what is commercially viable and we seed fund and then we let it run, you know, and then eventually the market has to pick it up and it has to go. But we can't forever, you know, subsidize certain activities, or then we have to make a conscious decision. And the last point I just wanted to make, I mean, there's a good reason why capital is not flowing to the least developed countries or fragile conflict-affected states, unfortunately. I mean, often the framework conditions are bad, there are security issues, and if we talk about impact investments, we still talk about investments. And you put money and you expect the money to come back. And so one important part, that's actually our biggest work we are doing is really on improving framework conditions, economic framework conditions, macroeconomic stability, working with ministries of finance on public finances and transparent budget processes, investment trade regulation, making the business environment more friendly, not so cumbersome for investors, and so on. So I think that needs to be also very much in the attention.
Yeah, that capacity building, which actually there are actors that are good at doing that work, and they should focus on doing that work, right? You wanted to add something, Jan?
Yeah, so just to add, indeed, it means the views that we have as World Bank Group on which sectors indeed are more suitable, etc. Yes, we do realize that in order for investors, and also ourselves, by the way, as IFC, whatever we do needs to be commercially viable. So we don't invest in any project if we don't believe it is profitable. But so therefore, yes, so that is basically why the World Bank Group's strategy, if you want, is regarding what is called cascade, meaning realize that certain projects will need to be financed by the public sector, and there will be very, very little interest by the private sector. But on the other hand, there are many sectors, and that comes back to this creating market strategy, that actually can be financed by the private sector. So the strategy is whatever can be financed by the private sector, let the private sector finance it, so then you free up the fiscal space that countries have to finance basically what they really have to finance.
So yeah, thank you for that, and I think that's really key. We get to the crux of the conversation is that everyone cannot address everything in the same way, right? And that's why collaboration is also so key. And maybe we'll go to Bertrand now. I mean, you wrote a book entitled "Can Finance Save the World? Regaining Power Over Money to Serve the Common Good." And I mean, in your experience, listening to all of this, we talk about kind of bankable projects and attracting private capital. What are the key ingredients of success to do that, irrespective of the theme, right?
It's very interesting to be on that panel because I've been in everybody's shoes. So I remember when I was in high school, one of my teachers told me, I'm very bad in French, je suis nul. But it's good because I'm nul en tout. I'm bad in everything. So I'm a little bad in everything you've done. And so, of course, I spent a few years with the IFC and the World Bank. I'm now also boots on the ground, not in Africa, but in Latin America, with Blue Like Orange, and I'm confronted to what you do. And I also worked with President Chirac on French development aid and agencies. So, and for me, and that's what I wrote in that book, I've participated, like many in these rooms, to dozens of panels where people say, yes, we need to cooperate, silos, etc., which is absolutely true. And the truth is, I think the situation is getting worse, not better, on that front. I'm afraid this is a side effect of the growing distrust in the system, where the private sector is reluctantly engaging with the public sector because they think they are too slow, if not corrupt and bureaucratic, etc., which is true. I mean, again, now I'm on the side of the table. And the public sector is very nervous because they fear to be accused of favoring somebody or of getting the risk without taking the reward, etc. And so everything becomes very cumbersome, bureaucratic. I've been tasked by President Macron to lead the One Planet Lab with Nick Stern and Paul Polman. We just produced with Hans-Peter Lankers, that you probably know, a report on blended finance. And I made the case that one of the issues of blended finance is not so much to find new instruments. We know all of them. We've tried all of them. It's about trust. It's about culture. So do we seriously want to do this together? It's not just blending finance. It's blending culture. It's blending skills. It's moving a step further. I believe, I mean, one of my big frustrations when I was at the World Bank was the limited true cooperation in the system between the various DFIs and multilateral development banks, etc. There is so much more we can do by cooperating. We all know that. We are all very smart. We all have plenty of examples. The question is, how do we scale this up? And that's, for me, the reality. And I was expecting COVID to be a triggering point to get there, and it has not been a triggering point. Let's face it. It's very much the way it was before. So I think at the heart of everything we are discussing is, coming back to my point, are we serious? If we are serious, we really have to change a lot of things in the system, not just showcase through examples, through projects, etc. And say, yes, we've done that, we've done that. Yes, we've done that once. Why don't you do it 1,000 times? That is the real issue. My other point is also because it's another on the critical path we're facing today. So 10 years ago, impact was still the Wild West. You could define yourself as impact, and I'm doing impact, I'm a great guy at impact, etc. Today, it's less so, in particular with the EU moving in that direction. So you have the directives, you rank the fund, and you say what is impact. And one of the issues we are facing today, it's very interesting because usually when you discuss impact, it's very rare that all participants are focused on emerging and developing economies. Usually they are focused on Switzerland, France, and the US. So for once, we're on the right side. But the issue is with this impact categorization that we're entering into, we move to the investor world where you have the tick the box syndrome. And so you will ask, okay, is this impact if A, B, C, D, E, F are okay? The question we are facing with that is it adapted to what we are discussing today? And the answer is quite often no. Because if I want to be provocative, we run the risk to become the bobos of this world, or the hipsters of this world. So we know what is good for the world, and we'll tell you what is good for your world. And it's not adapted to people which are not where we are today for a number of reasons, including sometimes our fault. So how can we address that gap without creating a divide in today's world, or without creating a premium impact in advanced economy and a low-cost impact in developing world? So I think we have a lot of things that we need to address, and we should really focus on how to work together, but not just in panels or in words, but how do we really move forward into the system? How do we incentivize every participant to the system to work with the other, including with a compensation policy? I would make the case that every international organization should be paid mostly on its capacity to truly mobilize other people's money, to truly work with others, not just plant your flag on a nice project. So this is a revolution, and it's very tough because this is truly embedded, and as we know, there is no real depository of the system anywhere. So that's, again, I'm still optimistic. I wouldn't be there, but I think we need to push.
I think if we're working in this space, you have to be optimistic because otherwise it doesn't advance. Really, really interesting. We're getting to the end. Time flies. All these insights coming in. I'd like to have a bit of time to open up to questions from the audience. But before I do that, short, tangible actions for the private finance sector to address the supply and demand mismatch. So, any closing thoughts on that would be really helpful. Concrete actions. Jan?
Yeah, easier said than done, but I think changing the mindset, right? So I think conferences like this clearly help, right? So one point which the audience perhaps may be wondering when I spoke about IFC and all these investments, etc., and knowing that everything is sustainable, what we do, so all our clients need to adhere to E&S standards, is this also profitable? Actually, studies show that we outperform market indices. So basically, impact and financial return do go together. And I think that's a very important message to start changing mindsets. I think another point indeed is that it shouldn't be basically the bubble amongst us here in this room. Indeed, the communication point that was mentioned this morning, I think is very important that we all know it. So for me, that is one of the main points. And indeed, the actual point is if you haven't joined the operating principles for impact investing yet, then please do.
Jerry?
I guess I'll repeat the first points I made, which is increased collaboration across all the different groups. The second point would be probably around more flexibility around the lifespan of vehicles that are being used to pursue impact. This is probably informed by the work that we've been doing in agriculture, where we generally need a longer lead time, but it's taking a long time for the market to move towards slightly longer fund lives. And at the risk of saying that I'm selling ABC Fund too much, ABC Fund is a permanent capital vehicle, which goes all the way to the extreme and just says, we're going to be here forever. We'll raise different tranches of capital to keep on supporting the sector. But I think we need more people looking in an open-minded way about the structures that are being used to deliver the impact. Then the third point I would make is there should be more of an effort to listen to the opinions of the people, the supposed beneficiaries of the impact. Because if there's, and we are all guilty of this, as a financial intermediary, I don't listen so much to the companies that I'm going to invest in. Similarly, when I go and speak to potential LPs, probably listen to about 60 or 70% of what I say. But I think we should spend a bit more time listening to people to be, should I say, one step down the value chain from us, so that what we're implementing is really relevant to their lives and also to the SDG goals that we're trying to achieve. So those would be my 3 points. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll pick up where you stopped. Looking at real needs and real impact. I think that's absolutely central. And then an offer to Bertrand. Yes, of course, impact. I mean, we've in development agencies, we've been doing development impact for the last 60 years. So it's still a bit complex, but I think it can be broken down. But we have to crack this conundrum somehow. And I don't know the recipe, but the best start would probably be to get into a room and then lock the door, all with our certificates, but then get out when we've cracked it. But I think it's possible. It cannot be that difficult. The second point, what I learned in all these years in the private sector with an asset creator, so a listed company, when talking to investors, were two things. One is it's about hard numbers, and two, it's about belief. And belief, trust has a huge influence at the end of the day. So, in my view, it's about high time that we in the North start about believing in investing in the rest of the world. Voilà, that's it.
Picking up on what you said about collaborative efforts and also what the others said, I'm pleased to say that after tomorrow, on Wednesday, we will announce a new initiative by our State Secretary, Marie-Gabrielle Ineichen-Fleisch, and it's the SDG Impact Finance Initiative. It was actually today an article in the media already as a pre-sneak. It's exactly about collaboration and scale and innovation. It will have 3 windows. How can we pilot and test and experiment, but always in mind that this must be commercially viable investment opportunities. And then the scaling, because we really want to bring in investors, banks, financial institutions, institutional investors, and then the ecosystem windows, that brings together the different actors with sustainable finance, the regulatory side on really analyze the academia, to really analyze where are the hurdles and how can we join forces, because I see so many great initiatives. Everyone wants to be involved in this field because it's now, it's a la mode and it's the future. I mean, you have to be involved. But the right side and the left side, they don't know what they are doing. And we need to bring this together, to be a bit more efficient, a bit more effective. And I hope that this joint collaboration with SDC together and important private actors, they will bring funding as well, that we can make a contribution to that.
No, I'd like to reiterate that we cannot underestimate the challenge ahead of us. I mean, we can talk forever. There is a true urgency, a true environmental urgency, there is a true social urgency, and this will not be addressed by doing more of the same. End of the story. So that's really, if we are not persuaded of that, we should just all go home and continue to dance as long as there is music, as the other guy said. No, so I think it's extremely important. We're not. It's not a game. It's a reality. So I have two answers to your question. One is I would say the commercial one. That's why I've made the decision to create Blue Like an Orange to find ways to channel money in SDG finance in emerging markets by providing private money, and some in this room actually. Thank you very much. And we can make money and have an impact. This is everybody has said it. This is not the point. The question is perception, as you rightly say. And the second point is less commercial and more systemic. I think today, on the one hand, you have even this diminishing a little bit today, 10 to 15 trillion of dollars, which are invested at zero or negative rates in a world where the needs are gigantic, where the urgency is there. So we have a massive capital allocation problem. How do we address that? Do we sleep like if nothing is happening, or do we find solution? Or do you prefer to have this money sleeping in safe havens in any country like Switzerland, but others? Or do we prefer to stock that money and build walls and put Navy warships in Mediterranean or next to Australia to prevent migrations? That's the issue. I mean, this is a capital allocation. And so my point is really we have to keep in mind that we are not discussing a nice add-on to the financial system. I truly believe that if we don't seriously believe that impact is to become the norm within the next 20 or 30 years, we are losing our time. We will have a side bucket where we feel better, like when you give money at the church or at the temple and you say, yes, I've given my money, I feel better. Or are we really addressing the root causes of what is wrong in this world today? So I think we really have to work this way. We also have to, because when French people say, yeah, French, they like the revolution, you cut the head, you abolish the privilege, etc. Il y a qu'à Faucon, there is a grand soir, etc. No, it will take 20, 30 years. It's a long job. But if we don't start now, there is zero chance that we ever get there. But we have to mainstream impact, not to side impact. And that's why it's not addressing the supply and demand mismatch, it's to addressing the mismatch of impact into the financial system itself.
Thank you very much for that, to all for these final thoughts. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you very much. Combined with a question as well. You talked about the challenges and these obstacles, and I want to pick up on one that many of you mentioned, which is about the end-to-end collaboration and the different roles in the ecosystem. And I think this ties very well to the other issues that you raised about, return, risk, and impact kind of triangle. So I see a role I will speak from the UN's perspective. I really see a role that nobody's picking up, and we as the UN and UNDP specifically started addressing. And I think, there's room for more collaboration and for the other players to ask and demand this kind of role from us, which is exactly on this angle of what is the prioritization of the SDGs, how do we address the risk at the national level, how do we de-risk by enabling the ecosystem and the enabling environment in these countries, influencing national level policy decisions in the developing countries. So I really would be interested to see how how do you see the role of UNDP or the UN in this, where we are in 170 countries around the world? We work with governments on policy making. We work with the private sector, with the local NGOs. We understand the local context, so have access to the information and do the analysis that could really inform this de-risking and impact increasing approach that you talked about. So just to give you an example, and then maybe you can reflect on that, how we can close the gap on this blending of skills and blending of collaboration. We have just created in 17 countries investors' opportunity maps. What they do is they bring together exactly this return, risk, and impact triangle, basically saying what are the prioritized SDGs at the national level, for example, in Armenia, where investments are more needed than in others, then have the measurements and monitoring around it so that we can see if certain of these priorities are overinvested or underinvested, determine the risk around these opportunity areas, and then a potential return on investment. So then, this is something that can turn into pipeline, and then that links to your arguments of the bankable projects. So I think there's a lot that we can do by really strengthening the roles of the different players on the ground, beyond just kind of the financial sector and involve other agencies. But then it comes to the fact that you said who is paying for it. And this could be, some of the discussions of how do we pay for creating this joint and a global public good that can then help your work of bringing the investments to the investment opportunities that are out there. Thank you.
So was there a question on the role of the UN, or was that just a comment?
No, the question, how can we strengthen this collaboration, and why aren't you using us more from a financing and investors' perspective?
Any thoughts on the role of the UN or strengthening this collaboration?
So as I was listening to you, some of the contributions of my fellow panelists also sort of started running around in my head. The key one being around the feature of trust in fostering these types of collaborations. And I also recall something that I read many years ago about how innovation happened in corporate America, especially among the really large, successful businesses. I think most of them found that when they wanted to start something new, they literally had to take some people from the mothership and throw them across to the other parts of the country and tell them, set up that lab and develop this new idea. So I'm not quite saying that this is UNDP's role, but I almost feel like we need to create some new organizations that have some public sector people, private sector people, NGO people, who have the trust of the organizations from which they came, get them to innovate on some things together, but with a commitment of their mother organizations to put capital into it. Because your guy is there or your girl is in that innovation team, and see if that works. And I'm only saying this because I haven't seen it happen before, and I think it's time we started trying some new things.
If I may add, based also on my experience, in particular with the World Bank Group, I think it is essential. I don't want to say somebody's doing a good job or somebody's doing a bad job, but it is very important that everybody makes the effort first to have skin in the game, as you rightly said. Don't just lecture and put nothing on the table. And second, I think it's important to force yourself to be in other people's shoes. I've seen too often people telling, this is what you need, but you didn't ask me. I know better than you what you need. And I've seen that many times. It seems laughable when we discuss that, but I have plenty of experiences. And so it's very important to force to listen to others. I think one of the key ingredients which had been lost with the financial crisis, which is lost again with the COVID crisis, is trust between people. And trust between people starts by listening to others, taking the time, and don't be too assured of your own truth. I think it's important. It's easier said than done, but it's critical. In this moment in time, we really need to open our ears and listen to others.
Yeah, so from my point of view, I do see where you come from. You used to be country manager in the Caucasus countries. So Armenia, you mentioned, is one of them. So in my view, there is scope for increased cooperation amongst the various international institutions, including development finance institutions in emerging markets. There is too much competition. particularly in the smaller countries. Too much race to the bottom, what I said earlier in terms of the pricing. Insufficient coordination on the agendas, because everybody comes with his own perspective. And perhaps indeed, to pick up what was just mentioned, perhaps at the UN and in many countries that does happen already, plays indeed a role to basically bring that group together. Of course, there are network lunches and breakfasts and whatever amongst the international community already in these countries anyway, right? But a lot of stuff needs to happen on the ground per country itself. So I see indeed an opportunity there. And perhaps to what was mentioned earlier, perhaps maybe more aspirational, the DFIs need to reconsider the way that they operate. And perhaps you've mentioned, like, the way to define their success is more to mobilize funds, because you do see everybody needs to cover the cost. So we do see that indeed certain transactions are just booked by DFIs just to cover the cost. That's basically it, and to show to the HQ they also have certain commitments in place, whereby you can really wonder what is the added value of that transaction by doing exactly the same as somebody else for a cheaper price. Unfortunately, that happens.
Yeah, please, Ron and Juliana.
Thanks. Just a quick answer. Of course, and we're working with UNDP both at a country level in our priority countries, at the regional level, and at global level. And I think a lot of official development aid money will still go to the poorest, will still go into governance, into creating these framework conditions which Liliana talked about, in fighting corruption, in creating the enabling framework. But I think we've reached to the limits of where we could get, and this is where private sector funding comes in, and this is where private sector funding can probably go, or could go, a long way further than it does today, and because otherwise we'll simply not get to the SDGs anyway in any near future.
I mean, collaboration is key, and we sometimes also need to force international organizations to collaborate on the ground. But I think it's equally important that each organization's focuses also on its comparative advantage. What we're seeing is sometimes a convergence that everyone is trying to do everything, which I think is not always healthy. I mean, there are some that have the DNA to invest, others less, and there I think, I mean, if you look at the UN universe, for example, the UN CDF is really, it's an investment vehicle, but it really does something that an IFC is not doing, so here we have complementarity, and that's good. But I think one really has to look that we're not duplicating, and then we enter into an unhealthy competition, which we see in the DFI world quite a lot. On the positive, on development finance institutions, I was last week at the European DFI meeting, and there is really a need and the recognition that they have to collaborate more. So if there are co-investments, then you do joint due diligences, and you do joint, assessments and reporting and so on. And that is important, and that can happen more and should happen more.
Any other burning questions? I don't want to eat too much in the coffee break, but it's an interesting conversation.
My name is Liliana was already, so I direct my questions to the persons directly, if you allow me, Madam Moderator. Liliana, you were talking about investments 20 years ago. What is the impact of the investment right now? Is the impact owned by people out there, or is it still owned by the investors, keeping people there independent? Bertrand, to you, the question, how do you define in your publications and in your spoken words, how do you define impact? Is it impact that can be owned and driven forward by people? Otherwise, something is really, really missing. Because that is what we see in our 65 member countries, where people want to have investment, but not becoming dependent of global bobos that will dictate their future or dictate the future of their country. Sorry, I'm a little bit frank here, but I want to have clear answers. Thank you.
Sure, thank you for these clear questions. I can give you the example of Profund, which was an international microfinance fund, one of the first one in the late 90s. And I think it was closed after 10 years, and it provided access to almost a million micro-entrepreneurs throughout the lifetime. And I mean, once the investors exited and the fund was closed, there is no dependency. I mean, what we know from micro-entrepreneurs, of course, not all will, become successful entrepreneurs. Some will still continue to struggle. But in many cases, you provided a livelihood for these people. And through access, we know that through access to credit, you can grow your own entrepreneurship, and you can sometimes you have funds to provide for health or other expenses. That's quite documented. I'm not saying that microfinance is the solution to everything, but I would certainly counter answer that this created a new dependency. On the contrary, I think in many cases it created independence, an economic and hopefully social independence.
Well, thank you very much first for your orange scarf, which is a very nice solidarity signal. Second, I've not entered into too much detail about what I'm doing, but I will now. So I've created Blue Like an Orange 4 years ago with the idea to invest in SDG-related projects and companies in Latin America first and 2 more in Africa. To answer precisely your question on impact, it has been at the heart of our approach. So we played with how to engage on this, and we came with something which we put on open source in our website. So we explain exactly how we assess any investment from an impact perspective. Now we try to connect the dots with the new EU framework, SFDR, to make sure that it's okay. Coming back to my point on making sure you don't have premium impacts in from here and the low-cost impacts in from there. And so we created an impact rating. So the way you can compare the credit rating of the World Bank and the credit rating of Man La Roche and the credit rating of the French Republic, how can you compare the impact rating of a project in water to the impact rating of a project in health to the impact project in education, etc., without being too subjective or without being too much driven by your preference for health, education, water, etc. So what is the dollar impact value that you can assess to a given project? And that's where the problem starts, because it's difficult. You always have a level of subjectivity. What we've made as a decision is to say there are 4 themes that we want to use for every project, whatever the sector. First is job creation, because at the end of the day, this is what, according to us, and this is our preference, according to us, this is the #1 factor when we invest. Does it create decent job, yes or no, and to what extent? Second, gender. And gender because it's important, and then we have KPIs. I can enter into the detail. Gender because it's important per se, but it's also when it's not being properly handled, it's a signal of things which are going wrong. So I think it's very important. Third, we did not focus on climate. We have, because for obvious reasons, to measure greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So that's done. But we've taken the 12.6 SDG, which is environment. So not only greenhouse gas emission, but air pollution, water, etc. So does the management of a company or project take into account environment? And the 4th criteria that we systematically screen is innovation. So innovation, environment, gender, and job creation, 50% of our rating. And then we have a sector-specific approach for water, health. The combination gives us a rating. And like a rating, you can be upgraded or downgraded. It's a very interesting conversation with the CEO of the company. for the timing, we don't have any relationship with the cost of our financing, but we might eventually have one. But when you discuss with a CEO and say, you've been downgraded, the guy nobody likes to be downgraded, even if it has no consequence. So you start engaging and say, you've been downgraded because A, B, C, and D. Oh my God, I didn't understand that, and let's address this, etc. So it's very pedagogic. So that's where we are coming from. Is it perfect? No. But it's transparent, it's open, and I'm very happy to take any criticism. We've already taken some, and we are very much willing to make this a living tool. Thank you.
So thank you very much to all. We've gone a little bit over time. I think maybe to wrap up some key takeaways that I've heard from around the table. We're faced with a systemic shift, and we need to understand the outcomes across the entire value chain. So impact's not about a niche. It's actually about outcomes across everywhere. Less bureaucracy, more experimentation, blending culture. Right, we talk about blending finance, blending culture and skills, increasing knowledge across the system in order to increase trust as well, which is key, because that's how we build trust. And incentivizing collaboration, which I think we heard several times the word incentivize. And if that collaboration is not incentivized, it won't happen. Can't force people if their incentives aren't aligned. The importance of long-term vehicles as well, so aligning the duration for investors, and finally focus on areas where you can maximize impact within your organization, not trying to boil the ocean and do everything, but focus on those areas where you can make a meaningful difference as an organization. So thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the end of the conference, and have a great week ahead. Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists.